Tonight we're slipping quietly through the thick forests of ancient Indonesia, barefoot and careful not to wake the geckos. You're crouching in the flickering firelight beside a curious stack of dried leaves, long, thin and stiff, like oversized crispy noodles. In your hand, a sharp little stylus made of bone, or maybe bamboo. And in front of you, a person is scratching carefully into the leaf's surface, line by line, with the kind of focus usually reserved for brain surgery or IKEA furniture assembly. They're writing, but not on paper, and not with ink. You, my friend, are about to dive into the surprisingly sharp, scratchy, and flame-prone world of what people in ancient Indonesia used before paper ever made its crinkly debut. One warning though, don't get too comfortable yet. The humidity's brutal, the bugs are relentless, and honestly, you probably won't survive this as a real ancient scribe. But hey, you've got modern comfort and a pillow fortress, so let's pretend. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing how far this sleepy little caravan travels. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You sit under the shade of a lontar palm, its fronds stretching like green hands above you. The leaves rustle in the warm breeze, but you're focused on the dried, yellow-brown strips in your lap. These aren't random plant bits, they're lontar leaves, trimmed, boiled, dried, pressed, and sanded to become something very specific. A writing surface. This is your paper, though calling it that would probably get you laughed out of the village council. You don't write with ink either. Instead, you wield a stylus, sharp, precise, usually made from metal, wood, or bone. It's less write and more etch, really. You scratch tiny curves and slashes into the leaf's surface, a method so unforgiving that one sneeze might ruin an entire page. And then comes the weird part. You rub black soot or a dark powder into the grooves to make the letters pop. It's like reverse coloring. You're literally filling in the wounds you made in the leaf. It's painstaking, sure, but surprisingly durable. If the bugs and fire don't get it first, these lontar manuscripts aren't just for jotting down shopping lists or doodling mandalas. No, they're used for poetry, law codes, calendars, myths, medicine, and sometimes for stuff you really shouldn't say out loud, rituals, curses, divination. You find one passage warning about what happens if you anger the rice goddess. Spoiler, no rice, ever. And while it might seem casual now, owning a lontar manuscript in ancient Bali or Java, that's a sign of status. Literacy wasn't exactly widespread, and preserving knowledge took real effort, both mental and botanical. You had to harvest the right palms, cure the leaves, and hope it didn't all rot in the next monsoon. Historians still argue whether these manuscripts were primarily religious or bureaucratic, because the surviving ones are often spiritual in nature. But maybe that's just because nobody bothers preserving old tax documents for 800 years. Unless, of course, they were written on bronze, but that's another section. You gently lift one of the manuscripts and it creaks like an old wooden toy. Each leaf has a hole through the middle, allowing the leaves to be bound with string or tucked between wooden covers, almost like a very awkward, pokey paperback. This isn't meant for speed reading, it's meant to last. If not forever, at least long enough to outlive the termites. Some of the oldest examples come from Bali, where the lontar tradition still exists today. In fact, there are whole villages where you could still sit with someone's great-grandfather, and watch them prep lontar just like they did centuries ago. It's living history. Hot, humid, and probably full of ants. A quirky little tidbit for you. There's a lontar manuscript in Bali that includes a recipe for an invisibility potion. Step 1. Find a black chicken and chant at it under the full moon. Not exactly FDA approved, but it shows how wildly varied the content could be. Oh, and the script? You're not writing in modern Indonesian? Most lontar manuscripts use ancient scripts like Kawi, Balinese, or Javanese. Beautiful looping characters that look like they were written by someone halfway through a daydream. Decoding them requires more than Google Translate and patience. Sometimes you need a whole temple of scholars. You scratch one more letter into the leaf, and it shivers just slightly under your touch. You're part artist, part historian, part monk. This is not a TikTok-ready moment. It's slow, deliberate, sacred even. You try not to sneeze. Lontar writing persisted for centuries, even after paper arrived from China and the Middle East. Why? Because it was already embedded into the spiritual and literary fabric of local life. Lontar wasn't just functional, it was ceremonial. You couldn't just abandon it for something easier, like switching from vinyl to MP3s. As the shadows stretch longer across the floor, you watch an old master scribe carefully apply soot to his finished work. His fingers are blackened, but the characters glow with life. He ties the stack with thread, slides it into a carved wooden case, and mutters something about keeping it dry. Or else. You lean back, the scent of scorched leaf and sandalwood hanging in the air, and wonder if the words you just etched will survive the next rainy season. You wipe your hands on your sarong, step away from the prickly palm leaves, and duck into a clearing where the scent of bamboo mingles with the smoky air. Someone's been burning incense again, or maybe just grilling fish. Either way, your next writing material awaits. And it's cylindrical. That's right. Welcome to the world of bamboo manuscripts. In ancient Indonesia, especially in places like Sumatra, Kalimantan, and parts of Sulawesi, writing on bamboo was surprisingly common. It makes sense, really. Bamboo is everywhere. It grows fast, it's strong, and when sliced open and polished, it becomes a shockingly decent canvas. You pick up a segment that's been dried and split. The inside is smooth, like varnished wood, pale as beach sand, and cool to the touch. The text spirals across it in careful rows, as if the writer had a ruler burned into their eyes. These aren't just random scribbles either. This bamboo cylinder could hold a genealogy, a song, a code of conduct, or maybe a spell to make your neighbor's pigs mysteriously wander into the forest. People wrote what mattered. Again, there's no ink. Instead, the writing is incised, etched into the surface with a sharp blade, usually a small knife or stylus, and then filled with soot or resin. You try your hand at it, but the bamboo resists you at first like it knows you're new. Your stylus slips, and now the word probably means lizard poop. Oops. Historians still argue whether this technique developed independently or was influenced by nearby cultures, especially since bamboo writing appears in parts of mainland Southeast Asia too. But in Indonesia, it took on a life of its own, tailored to the climate, the tools, and the local languages, some of which no longer even exist. You run your finger over the etched lines and notice the way the letters shimmer slightly in the light. It's subtle, but it's beautiful and fragile. Bamboo doesn't age well unless stored properly. A rainy season, a bored termite, or one badly placed torch and poof, history turns to mulch. Quirk alert. In some regions, young men would write love poems on bamboo and sneak them under a girl's window. Imagine being serenaded by a hollow stick. Romance, island style. Bamboo scrolls weren't typically rolled, despite the term scroll being thrown around by modern historians. Instead, they were stored in bundles, tied together with string, or fitted into carved holders. You can picture an elder opening a long box to reveal rows of bamboo slats, each containing parts of an origin myth or healing recipe passed down for generations. One unusual fragment discovered in Borneo includes a lullaby with instructions for how to calm a child while warning spirits not to nibble on its dreams. And also, yikes, there's something deeply tactile about the process. You can't speed through a bamboo manuscript. It resists haste. You have to cradle it, rotate it, follow the spiral of thought, and decipher the marks slowly. It's like the medium forces you to pay attention, to respect the labor behind each word. No skimming here. In some communities, bamboo writing was also used for teaching. Students would practice scripts by carving directly onto bamboo, knowing that every mistake was permanent. That's a terrifying level of commitment. Imagine doing your spelling test on something you couldn't erase. But it also meant learning wasn't just mental. It was muscle deep, etched into both bamboo and brain. You glance around and notice several pieces arranged upright in a basket, each about the length of your forearm. The tips are scorched slightly, not from accident, but by design. Sometimes, fire was used to harden the bamboo or sanitize it, or to burn in titles or decorative borders. Decorative, of course, meaning wildly unnecessary but incredibly cool looking. A nearby elder chuckles and hands you another piece. This one older, darker, its edges worn smooth. The writing is finer here, almost like whispering. You strain to read it in the dim light, catching fragments of a story about a crocodile king and a rain-making priest. It's part myth, part weather report, and part flex about controlling nature. This is what ancient media looked like. Not mass-produced, not anonymous. Every piece bore the mark of its maker, literally. Many scribes left little personal symbols, like a signature or a tiny drawing. A lizard, a flower, a star. It's like an ancient author bio, minus the blurry headshot. And then there's the sound. Bamboo creaks and clicks when handled. It sings under pressure, groans when it's old. You hold a bundle and listen to the chorus of little cracks and taps, as if the words are alive, shifting inside their wooden skin. Your guide points to a narrow ridge running along one bamboo strip. "Don't write there," he says. "It splits." Good to know. You're already responsible for one lizard poop manuscript. Let's not make it two. In the end, writing on bamboo wasn't just a clever use of resources. It was a whole ecosystem of thought. It merged local knowledge, environmental adaptation, and artistic flair into something that feels less like a relic and more like a conversation across time. You scratch one last line into your bamboo, blow away the dust, and imagine someone reading it 100 years from now. Then again, they might just use it to start a campfire. You rise from the bamboo grove, brushing a bit of soot from your fingers, and step toward a clearing that feels heavier. The ground crunches beneath your feet as you approach a pair of moss-covered slabs standing silently like forgotten guardians. You kneel. These aren't leaves or sticks. These are stone, massive, unmoving, and practically daring time itself to wear them down. And wouldn't you know it, ancient Indonesians wrote on these too. Stone inscriptions called prasasti, were the ancient world's hard drives. Only they didn't need charging and couldn't accidentally fall in the toilet. These things were built to last. In fact, many have. Across Java, Sumatra, Kalimantan and beyond, you can still find these stone relics peeking out of rice fields, temple walls, or being used as extremely fancy doorstops by people who have no idea they're leaning on a 9th century royal decree. You run your fingers over the grooves of one inscription. The script looks almost too perfect, like someone used a ruler and a prayer. These weren't casual doodles. Stone inscriptions were sacred, official, and expensive. They were often commissioned by kings to record laws, donations to temples, victories in battle, or maybe just to show off how literate they were. Imagine commissioning an entire monument just to say, "This land belongs to me now, thanks, bye." It's a power move. Very pre-Instagram, but just as extra. The script on this stone? It might be in Palava, an old South Indian script that early Indonesian kingdoms like Tarumanagara and Srivijaya adapted for their own use. Palava wasn't native to the archipelago, but like many imports, chili peppers, Bollywood films, it became part of the local flavor. Scholars still debate whether these scripts were taught by Indian monks, brought by traders, or just copied from passing ships. The truth is probably all of the above, but good luck getting two historians to agree after their third cup of coffee. You lean closer. The stone inscription isn't just flat. Some letters rise like little ridges, casting shadows in the slanting sunlight. It's beautiful in its own blunt way, like a poem written by a mountain. And often the content was just as intense. Land grants, religious endowments, curses against trespassers. May he be reborn as a flea on a toad's armpit. There's something about carving into rock that encourages bold statements. One well-known prasasti, the Tugu inscription from West Java, talks about digging canals for irrigation. Practical, sure. But when you chisel it into stone, it suddenly becomes heroic. Behold, I redirected the river and fed my people. Very Aquaman meets city planner. And it wasn't just flat slabs. Some inscriptions were etched into pillars, statues, temple walls, even boulders just lying around. If it had a surface and didn't run away, someone probably carved on it. You picture an ancient scribe, chisel in hand, muttering under his breath, because his king wanted another 10 lines by sundown. And no, Your Majesty, stone doesn't do spell check. Here's your quirky nugget for the night. In some spots, inscriptions were written in Sanskrit, Old Javanese, and local dialects all at once. Imagine reading a government document that's part Latin, part Elizabethan English, and part your uncle's weird fishing slang. That's ancient multilingualism for you, equal parts impressive and confusing. But these stones weren't just bureaucratic. Some told stories. Others documented temple rituals or astronomical events. A few even sneak in poetic flourishes, little rhymes and rhythms embedded in the legalese. You picture a bored court scribe who thought, why not make this royal tax decree rhyme? Spice things up. And don't forget the location. These stones were usually placed somewhere very deliberate, next to sacred trees, temple gates, rivers, or crossroads. They weren't just meant to be read. They were meant to be seen, remembered, even feared. You wouldn't casually graffiti over a prasasti. That's like tagging a tombstone with YOLO. Still, not everyone agrees on what all of them say. The stone lasts, yes, but the meaning sometimes slip through the cracks. Weathering broken pieces, evolving scripts. Deciphering some of these texts is like trying to reconstruct a tweet from a pile of gravel. And some inscriptions are downright mysterious, like the Sangyang Tapak inscription, which includes footprints carved into the rock along with the text. Whose feet? Were they symbolic? Did someone literally stand there during the dedication? Historians still argue whether it was a religious act or just ancient photobombing. You rest your hand on the cool stone, feeling the centuries hum beneath your palm. You imagine the hammer and chisel, the sweat, the repetition. Every groove carved with intention, maybe even reverence. And when the job was done, the result was immovable. Part art, part document, part territorial claim. But stone, for all its weight, isn't infallible. Volcanoes erupt, earthquakes tilt monuments sideways, moss creeps in. Still, what survives today feels like a whisper from someone who absolutely refused to be forgotten. You stand, crack your back, and take one last look at the inscription. It says something about an offering of 1,000 jars of coconut oil to the gods. You silently wonder how long it took to carry those. Then again, writing it into stone was probably the easy part. You leave the ancient stone behind, its surface still warm from the afternoon sun, and head toward the scent of sweet smoke and resin. There's a hush in the air here, something sacred, like a temple without walls. You follow a trail of cracked earth and find yourself standing before something that looks almost too delicate to be historical. A sliver of tree bark, aged to a leathery gold, with curling corners and faint lines that whisper of forgotten hands. Bark, specifically, tree bark manuscripts. You might laugh at first. Bark? Really? But you remember that before paper took over the world like a caffeine-fueled virus, people had to get creative with whatever grew around them, and bark was both abundant and surprisingly reliable. In the highlands of Sumatra and parts of Sulawesi, for instance, entire traditions were born and preserved on bark pages long before books, as we know them, ever reached these islands. You pick up a folded stack. It's thick, but flexible, almost like suede. It crackles softly as you open it, revealing an earthy brown interior inked with elegant black lines. No chisels this time. Here they used actual ink, but not the kind you're used to. This was homemade, brewed like a jungle potion from soot, resin, sugar, and plant extracts. Basically, forest coffee for scribes. The bark itself, often from the agar wood or bast trees, peeled carefully and softened through a process that usually involves soaking, scraping, and beating. Kind of like a spa treatment, but for trees. Once dried, the sheets could be bound together, accordion style, into what we now call pustaha. Folded bark books, most famously made by the Batak people of North Sumatra. And these weren't just grocery lists or tax records. Oh no, pustaha were mystical, sacred, often created and guarded by datu, the ritual specialists or shaman scribes who combined medicine, magic, and math in equal measure. You can't just flip through one casually. You're supposed to approach it with respect, or risk becoming the subject of its next curse. Because yes, many of these bark books were filled with spells. You hold one carefully and read a passage that appears to describe how to ward off evil spirits using lime juice, pig bristles, and a chicken's left foot. Specific. Another page offers instructions for creating a love charm involving, of all things, the reflection of the moon on water and a strand of hair. It's part science, part poetry, and entirely otherworldly. Quirk incoming. Many bark books were written in mirror script. That means the letters were scratched or inked backwards, and you had to use a reflective surface to read them. Either it was meant to keep knowledge secret, or someone just really liked messing with future readers. Historians still argue whether the use of mirror script had ritual significance, or if it simply evolved as a practical tool for privacy in a world without locks. Some even speculate it was a mnemonic aid, forcing the scribe to concentrate deeply. Either way, it's hard not to admire the commitment. Try writing an entire notebook backwards sometime. It's a real ego check. Not all bark books were mystical. Some included calendars, star charts, and even lists of medicinal herbs alongside their effects. Think of it as a medieval jungle version of WebMD, minus the part where it always says you're dying. One pustaha lists 45 different plants and their uses, including one said to cool the liver and calm the restless mouth. Translation: it's either a detox tea or a cure for gossip. The artistry too is breathtaking. Some bark books are decorated with intricate geometric borders, mythical creatures, or even full illustrations of rituals in progress. There's one where a tiny man is drawn wrestling what appears to be a crocodile, while someone in a pointy hat cheers him on. You're not sure if it's symbolic or a very intense fishing story. You inhale the faint scent of aged resin and smoke that still clings to the old pages. It's oddly comforting, like the smell of a well-loved library mixed with the forest after rain. Every part of the book feels alive, organic, hand-touched, full of personality, and absolutely irreplaceable. And that's the sad part. Many of these bark manuscripts are gone, either decayed by humidity, eaten by insects, or, more often, destroyed during colonial rule when anything labelled pagan or heathen was seen as disposable. Some missionaries reportedly burned hundreds of pustaha in single nights. Imagine the knowledge, the artistry, the voices lost in those flames. Yet some survived, hidden in attics, buried beneath floorboards, passed down quietly through generations. And today, a handful sit in museums across Indonesia, Germany, and the Netherlands, quietly testifying to the intellectual life of cultures many never imagined had books at all. You turn another page. The ink here has faded to a smoky grey. The script dances between symbols and letters, as if the scribe couldn't decide whether he was writing a manual or a poem. You trace the line with your finger and feel the pulse of someone who lived 1,000 years ago, who gathered bark, brewed ink, and sat in candlelight to write something important. You imagine the Datu, hunched over his folded manuscript, whispering words under his breath as he wrote. Maybe he looked up and saw a bat fly across the moon. Maybe he smiled. Maybe he kept writing. In the stillness of the forest clearing, surrounded by the whispers of trees and the hum of insects, you close the bark book gently. You don't need to understand every word to know it holds power. After all, when your books are literally made of trees, you tend to write only what really matters. You emerge from the thicket, hands still tingling with the memory of that bark book's faded spells, and head downhill toward the scent of salt. The wind carries a tang of brine and something else, an ancient sharpness like rust and time. As the coastline peeks into view, you notice scattered glints in the sand, catching the last gold of daylight. You walk closer, and there it is. Odd, surprising, and completely real. Copper plates. Yes, they wrote on metal. You pick one up. It's heavier than you expect, warm from the sun, etched with tiny lines that shimmer like fish scales. The plate hums with the authority, not just because it's metallic, but because it once bore the weight of royal decrees and sacred promises. In ancient Indonesia, especially between the 7th and 10th centuries, copper plates were the preferred medium for the very serious stuff. Land grants, tax exemptions, donations to temples. Basically, if it was going to cause legal drama later, they engraved it on copper. The term for these is prasasti tembaga. And they're not just relics. They're legal documents frozen in metal. You don't burn them, you don't crumble them, and you definitely don't lose them behind your couch cushions. They were meant to last forever. Some even had little holes punched in the corners, bound with a metal ring like an ancient binder clip. The organization? Impeccable. You can still find these copper plate charters across Java and Bali, buried in temple foundations, tucked into shrines, or sometimes sitting forgotten in dusty museum boxes. The detail is astonishing. Each line was hammered or engraved by hand, often in beautiful scripts like Kawi or Nagari, depending on the era and region. The dedication involved. Olympic level. You mess up a letter on paper, you start again. You mess up on copper. That's a whole new sheet, or a very angry scribe. And the content? Oh, it's gold. Metaphorically. One inscription from the reign of King Balitang in central Java grants land to a temple, lists all the surrounding boundaries, includes witness names, and even states what would happen to anyone who tried to dispute it. Spoiler, nothing good. Another one, the Laguna copper plate inscription, discovered in the Philippines but written in Old Malay with Sanskrit loanwords, reveals trade connections that stretched across the sea, Java to Manila, Sumatra to India. Globalization before it was cool. Historians still debate whether copper plate writing was only for royal edicts, or if wealthy individuals could also commission them. Some argue it was a status symbol. The bigger your plate collection, the more important your family. Others point out that not all inscriptions are equally grand. Some look like basic receipts, written by very ambitious accountants. But here's your quirky moment. Some copper plates were intentionally buried. Not lost, buried. Like sacred seeds under the soil. The idea was that by placing these decrees into the earth, especially under temples or royal buildings, they would gain spiritual permanence. You're not just writing history. You're rooting it into the bones of the world. You imagine a group of scribes, hunched over a low wooden bench, the copper sheet gleaming beneath their tools. No mistakes allowed. Someone stifles a sneeze. Another recites each line aloud for rhythm. Outside, someone chants. Inside, they etch, one tap at a time. You crouch beside a weathered plate half buried in sand. The lines are worn, but you can just make out the name of a king, Sri Maharaja something, followed by what might be a warning clause. Many inscriptions included them. Think of them as early DRM protection. If you mess with this grant, may your cows give sour milk and your ancestors shame you in dreams. The curses weren't subtle. And yet, even with all this weight, literal and figurative, copper plate inscriptions had flair. The script flowed in curves and slants, often decorated with small floral or geometric motifs. Some had royal seals stamped into the margins. Others included sankala, or symbolic dates encoded in poetic imagery. One line might read, "The elephant sleeps as the firebird dances," which, believe it or not, translates to a very specific year in the Saka calendar. Historians still argue whether the system was used for flair or for spiritual precision. Either way, decoding it feels like solving a riddle with a calendar and a mythological bestiary. You lift a copper plate slightly, feeling its cold heft settle into your palms. It's a quiet rebellion against decay. While leaves rot and bark cracks, this piece of metal remains, defiant and legible, even if covered in salt and time. And unlike stone, it can travel. Some copper plates were carried by invoice to distant lands, used as a legal proof or royal gifts. Imagine opening a suitcase in the 9th century and pulling out a stack of copper contracts. That's some serious TSA delay. The fact that so many have survived is a miracle, but it's also a reminder that the people of ancient Indonesia weren't just carving things to be pretty. They were building a memory system, a network of stories, rites, and warnings forged into the very elements: earth, tree, stone, and now, metal. You gently set the plate down, brushing sand off its corner like tucking in an old friend. Somewhere in the silence, you can almost hear the scratch of a stylus on copper, the breath held as each line was carved. A scribe's heartbeat syncing with the tap, tap, tap of history being made. You step away from the shoreline, leaving the copper plates gleaming like coins in the setting sun. The tide may come and go, but some stories are just too stubborn to drown. The salty breeze trails behind you as you step inland, the sound of waves softening into background static. You pass through a grove of banyan trees, their roots like fingers gripping the earth, and suddenly the landscape shifts. The jungle parts to reveal a gentle hillside scattered with curious shapes. Rows of what look like flattened sausages or oddly symmetrical loaves of bread. You blink. Nope, not lunch. These are palm leaves laid out to dry, waiting to become books. Yes, before paper took center stage, palm leaves were the paper of the tropics. You crouch to examine a few. They're smooth, leathery, and pale green turning golden. And soon, if history has anything to say, they'll be inscribed with scripture, genealogy, maybe even complaints about taxes. Welcome to the world of the Lontar manuscript. These weren't random jungle debris. The leaves were usually from Borassus flabellifer, the talipot palm. Not too thick, not too brittle, just right for carving letters into with a metal stylus. And yes, you heard right. They didn't write on the leaves with ink. They scratched the letters into the surface, then rubbed charcoal or lampblack over it, so the text would darken and stick to the grooves. You wince at the idea of someone doing this by candlelight for hours on end. Eyes squinting, wrist cramping, occasionally sneezing ash. But the results, striking. Each leaf becomes a page, and once a set is finished, holes are punched through the ends so they can be bound with a string. Kind of like a scroll, a flip book. And a Kindle had a very ancient baby. You run your fingers along the edges of a finished Lontar manuscript, stored in a wooden case carved with protective symbols. These weren't for casual reading. In fact, many Lontar were kept in temple libraries or in the homes of priest scholars who handled them with reverence, wrapped in cloth when not in use. And their contents, everything, epic poems, legal codes, mythical origin stories, even medical texts and how-to guides for building ceremonial altars. If it mattered, it went on a leaf. One of the most famous is the Kakawin Ramayana, a Javanese adaptation of the Indian Ramayana, retold with local flair. Prince Rama still fights demons, but the metaphors lean tropical, and there's a lot more shadow puppetry. Lontar leaves carried these stories from village to village, century to century. If you ever doubted the power of leaflets, think again. And now, your quirky moment. Some Lontar manuscripts were written in invisible ink. Well, not truly invisible, but they'd only appear under certain lighting. or after being dusted with a special powder. Scholars still debate whether this was to protect sacred knowledge or just the ancient equivalent of a keep-out diary lock. Either way, it adds a touch of espionage to your sleepy history. Historians still argue whether Lontar manuscripts were created exclusively by trained scribes in religious contexts, or if there was a more informal, household tradition of palm leaf writing. Some recent findings suggest that women, particularly in Bali, may have played a hidden but vital role in copying and preserving these texts, though much of the evidence is scattered or lost to time. And oh, the care involved. Each manuscript had to be maintained like a beloved pet. If a leaf cracked, replace it. If the writing faded, re-ink it. If bugs tried to snack on it, smear it with clove oil. Some lontars come with entire instruction sections on how to care for them, including when to bathe them with incense smoke. It's not a book, it's a roommate. You imagine someone from the 14th century, hunched under a stilt house, surrounded by drying leaves, carving syllables as chickens peck around them and incense coils burn slow. Maybe there's a thunderstorm rolling in. Maybe their toddler just stepped on a sacred verse and everyone had to pause to cleanse it with holy water and a small scolding. The sheer volume of work involved is dizzying. A single Lontar manuscript might span hundreds of leaves, each one the size of a chopstick, each line etched by hand. You start to feel a little guilty for complaining about paper jams or your phone keyboard lag. But these weren't just pretty documents. Lontars were activated by reading. In many Balinese traditions, you didn't simply study a lontar, you performed it. A priest would chant the text aloud, gesture, sometimes even dance. Think of it as half library, half stage. The manuscript came to life in the space between eyes and voice. As you hold a brittle palm leaf up to the light, the carved lines catch the sun and shimmer. The script seems to shift, almost breathing. You can't read it, but you feel its rhythm, like a heartbeat embedded in cellulose. Some of the ink has faded, but enough remains. Just enough to remind you that someone sat here, long ago, and trusted that their words would last, that a leaf could carry a soul. You return the manuscript to its case, careful not to bend a single page. The breeze picks up and rustles the trees overhead, their fronds whispering 1,000 tiny messages. Who knows what's still waiting up there? Untold epics, forgotten names, weather reports from dynasties past. You walk on, the sound of rustling leaves following like a soft applause. Some stories grow on trees. These are the trees. You push deeper into the forest, feet brushing over tangled roots and damp moss. The sun, dappled and filtered through thick green, catches on something at the edge of a rock formation. You squint. It's a shimmer, not gold, not silver. Something humbler, something more earthen. You crouch and brush away some debris, and there it is. A broken shard of clay, still curved, still marked. You run your thumb along it and feel the faint ridges of ancient script. Tonight's writing surface? Pottery. Yes, someone, somewhere, once scribbled a message across this piece of everyday ceramic, probably thinking, no one will care about this in 1,000 years. Jokes on them. You care now. Before the age of glossy scrolls and preserved leaf bundles, people wrote where they could. And sometimes they wrote on pots, or bowls, or fragments of vessels that once held rice, palm wine, spices, or maybe even love letters passed between merchant ships. These humble shards of fired clay, technically called ostraca, aren't unique to Indonesia, but they definitely show up here with their own island style. Imagine you're a trader in 8th century Sumatra. You don't have time to whittle bark or stretch palm leaves. You've got wet hands, a deadline, and a clay pot in front of you. You scratch a quick inventory list into the side with a sharp stick. Boom. Documentation. Maybe your kid's learning to write and uses an old bowl to practice their characters. Maybe a royal tax collector decides a ceramic seal is good enough to mark temple tithes. These shards are fragments of everyday life. Not lofty golden declarations, but the kinds of notes people leave on fridge doors or bathroom mirrors. The mundane, made meaningful by time. One particular find that gets archaeologists all fluttery is a series of earthenware inscriptions from Majapahit-era Java. Some were found in Trawalan, the empire's capital. Bits of glazed ceramics with Kawi script scrawled across the surface. Some of it decipherable, some of it stubbornly ambiguous. One piece may say something about a date and rice quantity. Another might reference a village name or a tax count. Historians still argue whether these were official notes or casual doodles. But the fact that they survived this long says something. It says they mattered, even if just for a moment. And here's your fringe fact of the evening. Some scholars believe these pot-written notes may have functioned like spiritual receipts, the kind you'd leave in shrines after a prayer or a vow. A sort of, hey divine beings, just logging my offering today, thanks in advance. There's even speculation that certain broken pots were intentionally shattered after inscription, as part of the ritual, because what better way to send a message skyward than breaking it open for the gods? That's the thing about ancient writing. It wasn't always meant to be read forever. Sometimes it was meant to be performed, spoken once and let go, or written once and then, poof, ceremonially destroyed. You imagine a village priest pressing a thumbprint into wet clay, murmuring a blessing, then cracking it over a fire. Gone, but spiritually filed. Of course, not all pottery inscriptions were sacred. Some were delightfully petty. In more recent discoveries, tiny tags were found etched onto ceramic roof tiles, naming the donor or craftsman. Kind of like someone tagging their work on Instagram. Handcrafted by Wayan in the year of the Great Flood. That sort of thing. A bit of ego, a bit of record keeping, a lot of clay. And unlike palm leaves, pottery doesn't burn easily, which is probably why we find so many bits today. They were broken, discarded, buried in ash or soil, and then, centuries later, unwrapped like time capsules. You might walk over one, thinking it's just a rock, but the right angle reveals a scratch, a curl, a name. You brush a bit more soil away from the shard in your hand. The script is faded, but there's a symbol that looks like a curled snake, or maybe a stylized letter. It catches the light just right, and you can't help but smile. That someone, 1,000 years ago, made their mark. Probably with no idea you'd be sitting here now, in the middle of the jungle trying to guess their grocery list. Historians still debate whether clay inscriptions were reserved for rural record keeping, or if they were part of a more widespread, semi-formal communication method. Some believe they were stopgaps for when other materials were scarce. Others think there was a deliberate ritual behind it, short-lived words for long-lived ideas. And here's a fun mental image. Somewhere in ancient Java, a child is caught scribbling their name into the side of a fresh ceramic plate before it gets fired. The potter scolds them, but the mark stays. Centuries later, archaeologists find it and declare it a sign of educational development. Who knew ancient graffiti could earn you historical prestige? You set the shard down gently, giving it a little pat like a page in a closed book. Around you, other pieces lie, half buried, half forgotten. Each one part of a sentence, a thought, a whispered joke in a kitchen long gone. You won't solve them all tonight, but now you know they're here. You rise and keep walking, feet crunching softly over leaves and bits of broken language. The earth is full of stories, some written on trees, some on stone, and some tucked into pots, waiting patiently for someone to read them again. You head downhill now, where the soil darkens and the air grows thick with the scent of wood smoke. Somewhere ahead, something crackles. Not a campfire exactly, more like the hiss of something baking under pressure. You duck beneath a low branch and step into a clearing where the ground is scattered with hardened black discs, each etched with crude lines and faded symbols. Some are still warm. Tonight's writing surface bamboo. Now, you might be thinking, isn't bamboo more for flutes and panda snacks? But here in ancient Indonesia, particularly in Borneo, Sulawesi, and parts of Sumatra, bamboo was one of the earliest, most versatile writing surfaces. It was abundant, sturdy, and, most importantly, it had that sweet, flat surface perfect for carving. As long as you didn't get a splinter in your palm mid-manuscript. You kneel beside a discarded bamboo tube, its surface polished smooth and stained a dark amber with age. A series of scratches wraps around it in spiraling bands. It's not decorative. It's a narrative. A story unrolling sideways across the surface, like a tree trying to talk. You trace one line gently, feeling the tiny indentations. These characters were incised with a sharp blade, then sometimes filled in with soot or crushed seeds for contrast. You're looking at bamboo epigraphy, the jungle's literary arts and crafts corner. And they didn't just write love poetry or herbal recipes on bamboo. Oh no! These tubes carried ritual chants, prophecies, legal codes, and even contractual agreements. If you promised your neighbor 3 chickens and a pig by the next full moon, you'd better write it down on a nice length of bamboo. Because once dried, these tubes could last decades, especially when stored in baskets, away from damp air and nosy rats. One particularly fascinating bamboo tradition comes from the Batak people of North Sumatra, who used what are called pustaha. These weren't scrolls or leaves, but accordion-folded manuscripts, often inscribed on bamboo slats or even tree bark, and bound between wooden covers. Some pustaha are dense with magical knowledge, recipes for healing, curses, or protection spells passed down through generations of Datu, Batak shamans. If you ever wondered what a jungle grimoire might look like, here it is. Fringe fact time. Some bamboo tubes were musical as well as literary, carved with words and tuned to produce tones when struck or blown through. Imagine reading a bedtime story that's also a flute solo. Multitasking ancient style. And in certain Dayak communities of Kalimantan, bamboo manuscripts were ritually sounded before being read aloud, meaning you'd lightly tap them to awaken the spirits encoded in the script. Whether for drama, superstition, or just fun acoustics, it made reading feel a little more like summoning. Historians still argue whether bamboo writing was considered formal literature or more of a folk tool, used casually for passing messages and then discarded or repurposed. Some researchers suggest a divide. Bamboo for local oral-centric cultures, lonta for centralized religious elites. But even that line blurs fast. One recovered tube contains both a creation myth and a list of village debts. Sacred and mundane, all twined together. The thing is, bamboo breathes. It bends. It warps in humidity. so you can't just toss it on a shelf and forget it. If you stored a bamboo manuscript carelessly, the writing could distort, curve, or fade entirely, which is maybe why reading one always carried a hint of reverence. You were communing with a living surface, something that still shifted and responded to time. You hold a tube up to the light. Faint script winds around it like a vine. It tells a story, something about a journey through crocodile-infested waters, a battle, a lost heirloom. You wonder how many hands it passed through. Did it live in a priest's hut? Or travel on a canoe? Was it ever read beside a fire? Or only whispered into on stormy nights? And here's a detail to keep you up later. Some bamboo inscriptions were hidden under layers of resin or sap. Scholars have found tubes with faint lines only visible under heat or moisture, like invisible ink, Jungle Edition. Were these secret spells? Smuggled records? Ancient pranks? No one's sure. But it adds a layer of mystery to an already enigmatic material. You ease the tube back down. Around you, other bamboo fragments litter the earth. Some split, others whole, all whispering in a language you can't quite decipher but still feel. You brush dirt from one that's especially worn and wonder if it ever held a farewell message, or a map, or just someone's angry diary entry. The wind rustles the tall grass as you move on, and you swear you hear the bamboo creaking behind you, as if the stories inside still want to be heard. You leave them to it, stepping quietly, careful not to crush a single syllable. You've now touched stories carved into leaves, bark, pottery, and bamboo. Each material chosen not just for convenience, but for its voice. Some whisper, some singing. Bamboo hums low and clear, like a memory remembered mid-dream. You follow the sound of water now, the hush and gurgle of a stream slipping between stones. The ground softens beneath your feet. Moss grows thick here, and the air is cool with mist. You crouch at the water's edge and spot something wedged between two roots. Flat, dark, almost metallic. You pull it out and realize it's not metal, it's bone. Tonight's writing surface? Bone and horn. Yes, actual animal remains. Someone, centuries ago, sat down with a sharpened tool and decided, this buffalo rib will do nicely. And it did. Because when paper was rare and bamboo too fragile, people got creative. You probably wouldn't call it eco-friendly, but it was definitely efficient. Picture a 10th century coastal settlement in ancient Indonesia. A fisherman has just finished cleaning a catch. He glances at the leftover bones and thinks, waste not. Next thing you know, he's engraving clan symbols into a length of fishbone or recording harvest tallies on a sliver of horn. Practical, morbidly sustainable. In regions like Sumatra, Sulawesi, and even parts of Papua, writing on bone wasn't widespread. But it did happen. And not always for record keeping. Sometimes it was for rituals. You carve a charm or protection spell into a sliver of horn, then hang it above the door. Other times, it's for identification, marking ownership, names, or family symbols. One recovered artifact even shows a series of tally marks along a jawbone, either a calendar, a death count, or someone's really intense goat registry. Historians still argue whether these markings were mnemonic aids or actual language systems. Most bones carry proto-writing, symbols and marks that suggest meaning, but don't yet spell out full words. Now, quirky fact for your dreams tonight. Archaeologists found a decorated deer antler in Kalimantan with a spiral of tiny notches carved all the way around. Some believe it was a record of full moons. Others think it's a song, meant to be read aloud in rhythm, as your thumb traces the spiral, like a prehistoric karaoke machine. The use of animal parts wasn't just utilitarian, it was also deeply symbolic. Different bones carried different meanings. Buffalo horn, often considered sacred, was believed to hold spiritual energy long after death. Writing on it imbued the message with that leftover force, sort of like charging your notebook with ancestral Wi-Fi. Some bones were buried beneath houses. Others were hung from trees or worn as amulets. Some were even burnt after being read aloud, releasing the message to the spirits in smoke. But let's not pretend this was mainstream. Bone inscriptions were rare, and likely limited to specific groups, shamans, warriors, healers, who understood their deeper significance. You can almost imagine a datu, hunched by firelight, carving a warning into bone and handing it to a runner who tucks it into a woven pouch and disappears into the jungle. There's an especially eerie example from Sulawesi, a long curved horn fragment with kawi-like glyphs etched along its ridge. Found in a grave, it was buried with its owner, who may have been a spiritual leader. The symbols? Mostly undeciphered. Theories range from funeral prayer to map to the afterlife. One scholar even suggested it was a record of tribal laws, like a horned constitution. But no one agrees. And honestly, it's kind of better that way. Bone, by nature, resists decay longer than wood or bark. It's durable, dense, and responds well to incision, but it also cracks with age and absorbs oils from the skin. So handling one of these relics today is like holding a page that's been alive. You sit for a moment, holding the rib bone in your hand. The script is faint, but deliberate. Maybe it was written by someone desperate, trying to preserve a message when every other surface failed. Or maybe it was casual, just a list, a spell, a joke between brothers. You'll never know, but it's here, still intact, still whispering. And let's not ignore the possible dark side. Some historians propose that bone inscriptions could have been punitive records, trophies, or warnings. A rival's name scratched into a bone and left at a village border, a mark of shame or conquest. If that makes your skin crawl, it should. Ancient people were human, and sometimes humans are creepy. But more often than not, the bones speak to connection, to memory, to the desire to make something last. Even when time and termites destroy bark and leaf and bamboo, bone holds firm. The stream beside you babbles on, as if trying to distract from the weight of what you're holding. You slide the bone back beneath the root, where it belonged, a soft offering. The forest will keep its secrets, at least for now. You rise and move on, the ground firmer beneath your feet now. The trees open up ahead, and you spot a glint of something stranger. But that's for later. For now, remember this. Even when materials were scarce, the urge to write, to record, to matter, never was. Your path leads you out of the forest and into a rocky gorge, where the air thins and the wind whistles through narrow stone passages. You step carefully, because here the ground can surprise you. Loose pebbles skitter beneath your feet like tiny alarms. Then you round a corner and freeze. A flat wall of reddish stone towers before you. On it, a handprint, faded but clear. Surrounding it, strange looping lines like symbols from a dream. You're looking at one of humanity's oldest urges, the need to leave a mark. Tonight's writing surface, cave walls and rock faces. This is the most ancient form of storytelling you've encountered so far. No scrolls, no inks, no prepared surfaces. Just rock, pigment, and determination. And in Indonesia, It's not just random doodles. Some of the world's oldest cave art has been found here, dating back over 45,000 years, deep in the limestone caves of Sulawesi. You brush your fingers across the wall, careful not to disturb anything. It's cool to the touch, slightly pitted from time and erosion, but the drawings endure. An outline of a hand stenciled in red ochre. A babirusa, a pig deer, drawn with thick, bold curves. And beneath that, a curious pattern of slashes and dots that doesn't seem decorative. It feels like script. Not a full alphabet, but something organized, something intentional. Historians still argue whether these marks count as writing. Most agree they aren't linguistic in the traditional sense, but many believe they were mnemonic devices, a visual aid to storytelling. Like PowerPoint for ancient bards, a symbol here might cue a line of a chant. A spiral might mean circle the fire and sing. You're not looking at sentences, you're looking at prompts. And in some places it goes further. In caves on Misul Island in Raja Ampat, strange geometric patterns accompany hand stencils, zigzags, ladders, dots in groupings. Some researchers think these are proto-symbols used for ritual or navigation. Others insist they had meaning, passed down through generations of coastal peoples who used these caves as spiritual checkpoints. Then there's the wild theory, your quirky fringe bit for tonight. One scholar proposed that certain handprints might represent names. Not just "I was here," but a kind of signature. Each hand painted with different finger positions, or framed by unique surrounding glyphs. Basically a prehistoric username. It's easy to joke about cave art as caveman graffiti. But when you're standing in front of it, when you really see it, it hits different. Someone stood here, tens of thousands of years ago, lit a torch, mixed ochre with spit or animal fat, and pressed their story into the wall. Not because it was practical, not because someone asked them to, but because they needed to say something, needed to be remembered. That's the thread running through all of this. Whether etched on palm leaf or scratched into bamboo, or smeared across limestone, ancient Indonesians found ways to record their lives in the textures around them. Of course, rock has its limits. You can't carry a cave wall with you unless you're very determined. So these sites became fixed points of memory, places people return to see, remember, perform. You weren't just writing, you were creating a location-based archive, like an old-school Dropbox, but you had to hike to it barefoot. And it wasn't just drawings. Many rock sites in Indonesia are tied to oral traditions, still passed down today. Some communities in Papua, for example, maintain legends about cave spirits, handprints that speak, and wall drawings that come to life under moonlight. Are these stories embellishments? Sure. But they also hint at a worldview where writing wasn't just ink on leaf. It was embedded in the landscape itself. Here's your mainstream historical anchor. The Sulawesi cave paintings aren't just among the oldest in Indonesia. They're among the oldest in the world. Older than the Lascaux caves in France. Older than most Egyptian inscriptions. Which means the impulse to document, the desire to reach across time, may have sparked here on these islands long before other civilizations picked up a chisel. And don't miss this eerie detail. Some of these caves are still in use. Locals leave offerings. Priests chant inside their echoing halls. It's as if the writings never stopped. They just changed medium. You crouch now and spot a faint line scratched into the rock, away from the main drawings. Not painted, etched. The scratch marks are deliberate. maybe done with a stone blade. It's not a recognizable script, but the rhythm of the lines, the spacing, it feels like a message, or maybe a song. Could you read it if you stayed long enough? Would your eyes adjust, your mind begin to pattern match, your ears hear the chant behind the scratches? Maybe not. But the wall remembers, even if you can't. The wind picks up behind you, humming through the gorge like breath over a flute. You take one last look at the cave wall, its stories both obvious and unknowable. Then step away. There are more writings ahead. Lighter ones, weirder ones. But for now, you carry the weight of the stone language with you, echoing softly between your shoulders. The path opens into a dry, sun-baked plateau. The ground here crunches underfoot, coarse, powdery, littered with scattered leaves and twigs. And just ahead, beneath a simple wooden shelter, you spot a collection of strange, sun-bleached objects laid out in rows. They shimmer slightly in the harsh light. No, not shimmering, reflecting. You kneel, and your breath catches. It's shell. Tonight's writing surface? Shells and turtle carapaces. You may not have expected mollusk accessories to show up in ancient Indonesian storytelling. But surprise, humans will write on anything if you leave them alone with it long enough. And here, in coastal regions where the sea shaped both diet and destiny, shells became more than jewelry. They were records. Start with the obvious, cowrie shells. These smooth, curved beauties weren't just currency. They also served as symbolic writing surfaces. In certain island communities, especially along eastern Indonesian coasts, cowries were strung together in patterns that represented lineage, status, or contracts. Each shell stood for a person, or a specific agreement, or even a calendar unit. It wasn't engraving exactly, it was combinatorial storytelling. Like a sentence made of beads. Historians still argue whether these shell arrangements count as writing, or whether they're more like relational coding, the way knots and spacing can indicate ownership or intent. But the symbolism is strong. One arrangement might tell of a marriage alliance between two families. Another might record a feud, frozen in shiny punctuation. But let's move on to something with sharper edges, turtle shells. In a few isolated sites, particularly in the Maluku Islands and parts of Papua, archaeologists have uncovered fragments of turtle carapace etched with lines, dots, and deliberate indentations. These weren't tools. They weren't jewelry. They were, brace yourself, messages to the gods. The working theory is that these shells were used in divination rituals. You'd write or scratch symbols into the shell, then expose it to fire. As it cracked, the pattern of fractures would be interpreted by a spiritual leader. Ah, the priest might murmur. The crack moves left. Rain is coming. The split runs toward the tail. Your brother-in-law is lying. You know, the usual sacred gossip. Here's your quirky bit of trivia. One charred shell fragment found on Seram Island bore not just cracks, but actual etched glyphs, unlike any local writing system. One linguist suggested they were loaned characters from Chinese divination scripts, brought by early traders and repurposed locally. Others insist it's just coincidental patterning. Still, the idea of a shell-based Ouija board from the 8th century is too good not to imagine. But not all shell writing was spiritual. Some communities use large, flat shells, like giant clam segments, as inscription boards. These smoother surfaces could be incised with sharp tools, storing names, inventory lists, or travel routers. And they weren't necessarily hoarded. They were passed around, carried between islands, a little like giving someone a laminated letter and saying, "Deliver this to Uncle Ogie across the bay." Durable, waterproof, and hard to chew, shells made great accidental time capsules, which explains why we still find them. One particular shell piece from Flores contains a series of notches in triplet groups. Some say it's a lunar cycle record. Others think it's an inventory list. And at least one fringe theorist proposed it's the first known tally of shellfish eaten by a single person. That would be impressive or disturbing. You shift now and peer at the arrangement under the wooden shelter. Some shells are laid in rows. Others are hung from twine. One has a deliberate spiral of holes punched into it, almost like braille. You touch it and feel the faint indentations, grooves made not just to be seen, but to be felt. For communities where oral tradition ruled, shells may have been the bridge between speech and permanence. A shell you could run your fingers across to summon a name, a story, or a warning. And here's a mainstream fact to anchor us again. Trading networks across the Indonesian archipelago were highly advanced even in pre-literate times. Shell-based communication, whether symbolic or direct, likely traveled with traders, spreading customs from island to island like messages in a tide bottle. We may never know exactly what they said, but the medium speaks volumes. You wonder now if someone long ago sat at this same spot, surrounded by empty clams, carving tiny dots into their smooth surfaces while the waves whispered nearby. Maybe they were recording deaths, maybe mapping currents, maybe just passing time, leaving behind a code that even now refuses to fade. And unlike bone or bark, shell offers a different kind of permanence. It resists water. It can't be eaten by termites. It gleams even after centuries. Like memory that refuses to dim. You gather yourself and stand, letting the light catch the glinting surfaces one last time. Whatever was once written here, whatever contracts, curses, or love letters, the sea has not erased it. You move on, brushing sand from your legs, stepping into the warmth of open space again. The next material will be lighter, flimsier, but don't underestimate it. Sometimes the most fragile surface hides the loudest voice. The wind picks up as you leave the shells behind, fluttering dry leaves and tossing your hair like it has opinions. And then, just ahead, you spot what looks like a bundle tied to a branch with palm fiber string. It sways in the breeze, rattling faintly. You step closer. It's bark. Thin strips, some painted, some scratched, all rolled up like someone's to-do list from 800 years ago. Tonight's surface? Tree bark. Flexible, flaky, surprisingly persistent. Before you laugh, yes, people really did write on bark. And in parts of ancient Indonesia, especially the interior highlands of Sulawesi, Kalimantan, and Papua, bark wasn't just an emergency notebook. It was an entire writing culture. Let's set the scene. You're in a forest. You need to send a message, store a ritual chant, or record a trade agreement. There's no palm leaf within reach, no bamboo, no prepared parchment. But there is a tree, the mulberry, or Brusonetia genus, to be exact. Its bark peels in long ribbon-like strips, perfect for processing into something flat and semi-durable. Locals would harvest the bark, soak it in water, then beat it flat using wooden mallets. The result? A papery, spongy sheet known in many parts of Southeast Asia as bark cloth. Not quite as smooth as modern paper, but it gets the job done. And once dry, it could be folded, dyed, and, most importantly, written on. Mainstream historical fact: barkcloth production has deep roots across Oceania and Southeast Asia, but certain regions of Indonesia developed it not just for clothing or wrapping, but as a textual medium. Among the Batak people of North Sumatra, for example, you'll find pustaha, folded bark books that look like chunky accordion-style grimoires. Inside, astrological tables, healing chants, protective spells, and the occasional curse that might make your toes curl. You open a pustaha now, carefully. The bark pages crack slightly. On each page, Batak script flows left to right in bold, swooping lines, written with a bamboo stylus and black resin ink, probably made from soot and plant sap. The text reads like a combination of weather forecast and dark fantasy novella. On the day of the red moon, do not harvest. The winds will turn against you. It's part science, part spellbook, and apparently part Yelp review for angry weather spirits. Quirky detail for the night. Some bark books were coated in buffalo bile to protect the ink. Yes, bile. It acted like a varnish, very gross, very effective. Also slightly green, which gives the whole page a charming swamp witch aesthetic. But bark wasn't just for curses. In Kalimantan, the Dayak peoples used bark strips to record genealogies, an ancient form of family tree inscribed down the length of each strip. They'd hang them in longhouses where you could walk along and trace your lineage with a finger, like a sideways scroll. See that dot? That's Grandpa. Keep going, past the guy who fought the monitor lizard, there's you. Historians still debate whether these records were truly permanent or simply temporary guides, meant to jog the memory during oral recitation. But one thing's clear: the bark recorded more than words. It held relationships. You weren't just writing about people. You were placing them literally in a visible and touchable line of continuity. Some bark surfaces were even layered. A scribe might write something, then paste another bark strip over it with resin. Secret messages? Reusable pages? Primitive multi-page contracts? Scholars are still guessing. One theory is that it allowed multiple versions of a chant or spell to be stored in layers, kind of like toggling between tabs. And now for your fringe theory. In a remote Papuan highland community, researchers uncovered a bark scroll that had punched holes in specific patterns, similar to early punch cards. Some believe it wasn't meant to be read by eye at all, but used in chanting rituals where you'd move your fingers across the holes and trigger memorized phrases, like a tactile rhythm cue. Others argue it's purely decorative. Still, you have to wonder, was that the world's first manual playlist? The sun is dipping now, painting the bark bundles in gold. You reach out and run your fingers along one page. The texture is soft but uneven. Your touch picks up the grooves where the stylus bit deeper. It's not a flat reading experience like paper. It's three-dimensional. Each bump and ridge carries information. Of course, bark has enemies: insects, humidity, fire, time. But the fact that any pustaha survived to this day is a miracle of preservation, and proof that for many centuries, bark wasn't just a backup material, it was the default. As you walk on, you imagine carrying a folded bark book in your satchel. You imagine being the person who first cracked the formula for resin ink, or figured out that mulberry trees had something to say. It wasn't flashy. It didn't glitter like shell or endure like stone. But it worked. And sometimes that's enough. You step past the final bundle, swinging gently in the breeze like a lazy metronome. And ahead, you see the flicker of firelight. Something's being written tonight. Not on leaf, not on bark, but in smoke and soot and shadow. The fire crackles softly as you approach, its glow painting the dark with flickering amber. Around the flames you see low wooden platforms, people seated cross-legged, and hanging above them, smoke-blackened slabs of bamboo, smeared and streaked with dark pigment. Someone dips a finger into a bowl of ash mixed with sap and continues scrawling onto the surface with care. The writing looks fresh, shiny while still wet. So tonight, you've arrived at one of the strangest and most ephemeral media of them all. Soot-covered walls and smoke-slicked bamboo. Yes, writing on soot. Not exactly what your stationery store carries. But then again, modern life is soft. Start with this. In some parts of ancient Indonesia, especially interior Java, West Kalimantan, and the Tanah Toraja highlands, people made temporary noteboards by holding a flat surface over an open flame until it collected a smooth layer of soot. These blackened panels could be anything: slabs of stone, hardwood planks, large leaves stiffened by heat, or, more commonly, lengths of split bamboo. Once the soot settled in a nice even layer, a stylus, often a sharpened twig or bone pick, would gently scrape through the soot, revealing the lighter surface beneath. A kind of reverse writing. You weren't adding ink, you were taking darkness away. Mainstream historical fact. This scratch-through soot method was well documented by Dutch observers in the 18th and 19th centuries, who were baffled to find farmers and priests alike using soot walls as notice boards and ritual calendars. Messages could be wiped clean with a swipe, like an ancient chalkboard. It was perfect for daily use, reusable, cheap, and totally biodegradable. But here's the kicker. While some soot writing was temporary, not all of it disappeared. Some scribes preserved soot texts by fixing them with resin or oil once the message was complete. This gave the black a wet, hardened finish and locked the markings in place. Think of it like spraying a clear coat over a pencil sketch. These preserved soot bamboo pieces were sometimes hung in granaries, where they served as harvest records or weather logs. Others were tucked into sacred spaces, cave shrines, dry niche where they've somehow survived the centuries. And now, for your quirky twist. There's one remote village record where soot writing was used for games. Children would draw simple grids or riddles into the soot, then challenge each other to erase the correct answers by scratching them out. Kind of like Sudoku meets scratch-off tickets. Entertainment was low-tech, but surprisingly advanced. Scholars still argue whether this soot technique counts as a full writing tradition or simply a pre-literate practice. After all, the writing often wasn't standardized. No alphabet, just symbols, markings, pictures. But many believe it was a training tool for oral reciters. You'd sketch out cue symbols, hints, maybe key phrases from a chant. Then you'd stand before the soot board and recite, using the marks as anchors in your mind. Let's pause there for a second. Imagine the scene. You standing barefoot in a smoky hut. The fire crackles behind you. You stare at a soot board covered in scrawled loops and slash marks. A cluster of villagers watches silently. You begin the chant. Slow at first, then faster. Your finger traces the markings like notes on a staff. You don't read aloud, you perform memory. You probably wouldn't survive that oral exam. No pressure. Some communities pushed the soot concept even further. They used it in contracts. Yes, legal contracts written on bamboo, blackened with smoke, etched with a deal, then oiled and sealed with a clay plug. The whole thing looked like a charred scroll, but carried weight, especially if witnessed by an elder. One fragment, found in central Sulawesi, records a land dispute between two families. One side offered goats, the other a beetle grove. The scratched lines mark out names and approximate boundaries. And someone, probably impatient, added a small drawing of what seems to be a very angry goat. And here's your fringe tidbit for the night. One 20th century oral historian swore that his grandmother had learned a sacred chant that could only be taught while facing a soot board, never just by voice. The markings were believed to hold the chant's structure, like a visual cage. If you erased the board too early, the memory vanished. You had to write it again by remembering the entire chant backwards. You have to admire a society where even erasing was a brain game. But soot had enemies too. Wind, rain, sneezes. One misplaced gesture and your epic chant could vanish into black dust. And yet, the simplicity of the medium was also its power. If you had fire, bamboo, and a stick, you could write. Anywhere, anytime. No ink required. Just smoke and memory. You run your hand over a soot panel now, one that's been sealed with oil, its scratches hardened into permanence. The lines form a graceful arc. Could be a name. Could be a warning. Could just be a scribe doodling a buffalo while waiting for someone important to arrive. We'll never know. That's the mystery of soot. It hides as much as it reveals. But for all its fleeting nature, it taught people how to encode, how to symbolize, how to think in marks and lines instead of just sound. It's a shadow medium, but it paved the way for more lasting things. You stand and brush your fingers off. Soot leaves a fine black dust on your skin. Behind you, the fire pops. Ahead, the path leads into a grove where the trees seem unusually squared. Wood. The next chapter is going to smell like sawdust and effort. The air thickens with the scent of sap and old wood as you enter the grove. The trees here don't grow wild. They stand in even rows, bark shaved in places, branches pruned with intent. On the ground are piles of planks, some smooth, some scarred, many of them marked with symbols, carved deep into the grain. You reach out and touch one. It's cool, dense, and not unlike the floorboards in your grandparents' house. But this plank isn't underfoot, it's a page. Because here, in this quiet sun-dappled patch of forest, you've stepped into the age of wooden manuscripts. Yes, you heard right. Tonight, you're reading wood. Not from pulp, not bleached, pressed, and packaged. This is wood in its primal form, shaped, sanded, and written upon with time and care. While bamboo and bark were favored for their flexibility, wood offered something else, durability. And when the message needed to last longer than a season, or impress more than a village elder, wood was the medium of choice. Mainstream historical fact: ancient Indonesians, particularly in Bali, Java, and parts of Sumba, used flat wooden boards, often made of jackfruit, teak, or breadfruit tree, as inscription surfaces for religious and legal texts. These boards, called lontar covers, when paired with palm leaf manuscripts, sometimes held texts themselves, especially when palm wasn't available. And unlike bamboo or bark, which required etching or ink, wooden manuscripts invited engraving. Out came the knives, the chisels, the tiny burns. Scribes would carve letters into the wood itself, slowly, carefully, then rub ink, charcoal, or resin into the cuts to make them legible. It was a process not unlike tattooing. And the result? Permanent, weather-resistant texts with serious gravitas. You kneel beside a wide board now, carved edge to edge. Its script flows in sweeping curves. Old Javanese, perhaps, or a localized Indic variation. It looks like it belongs in a temple. And you wouldn't be wrong. These wooden texts were often used for ritual instruction, astrological guidance, and laws. If someone in power said something important, and they didn't want it forgotten after the next harvest, you'd better believe it was going on wood. Now here's your quirky tidbit. Some wooden texts weren't rectangular. They were shaped as paddles, animals, even stylized boats. One rare piece from South Sulawesi is a carved crocodile whose spine carries a string of old Bugis script. Scholars still debate whether it was a mnemonic aid, a curse tablet, or just someone's artistic flex. But either way, someone carved an entire spell across a wooden lizard's back. You can't unsee that. Wood also lent itself to multi-panel forms. Hinged boards with connecting strings or leather ties were used to create folding books. An early prototype of the flipbook, minus the cartoons. In some Balinese temples, these foldable wood texts recorded not just myths and instructions, but community debts. Want to know who borrowed 5 chickens in 1342 and never paid them back? Just unfold panel 3. Receipts, ancient style. Historians still argue whether wooden texts were meant for portable use or meant to be fixed installations, hung on walls, embedded in shrines, or placed as permanent markers in sacred landscapes. Some boards, especially those found in burial sites, suggest that wooden writing was not just functional, but deeply ceremonial. To write something into wood was to seal it into the world. You walk further and notice another wood slab, this one smaller, about the size of a modern clipboard. But it's different. Instead of deep carving, it has fine surface scratches and smudged ink. You tilt it in the light. The wood has been oiled, the ink slightly raised. This wasn't etched. It was brushed, with a soft reed or coarse bristled brush. Some scholars believe this technique was used for practice boards, a sort of reusable notebook. Young scribes would train their hands here before graduating to palm or bark. The ink could be wiped clean with coconut oil. It was the medieval equivalent of dry erase. Now here's your fringe theory. In parts of eastern Indonesia, there are oral traditions of singing boards, wood panels inscribed with marks that supposedly guided melody rather than words. No written notes, but lines, dots, and curves that functioned like a visual melody map. It's speculative, yes, but imagine it. A wooden score for a song you don't read, but feel your way through. You sit for a moment, watching the sun fall through the trees. The shadows stretch across the wooden boards, highlighting their grain and texture. There's something humbling about it. These weren't made quickly. They weren't disposable. You get the sense that someone carved each letter like it mattered, because it did. And even now, centuries later, their messages haven't disappeared. The wood cracked, sure. The ink faded. But the words remain. You run your fingers over a panel's edge and realize you've touched the past. Not a copy, not a replica. The real thing. You half expect the wood to hum under your fingertips. But no, it stays still, quiet, heavy. You stand and take a deep breath. The scent of the forest mingles with the must of old timber. And for a moment, everything feels slow and steady. You leave the grove with a new kind of reverence, stepping around roots like they're part of the story now. Ahead, the trail dips into a valley where the light softens. You see something strange waiting at the base. Something grey, flat and heavy. Stone. You're almost at the end. But this next part? It's been waiting the longest. The air turns cool as you descend into the valley. The trees thin out, replaced by scattered brush and low-lying ferns. Under your feet, the soil gives way to stone. shards of shale, patches of gravel, and then, unmistakably, a wide slab of grey carved straight into the landscape. It's not just a rock. It's a page. A stone page, anchored forever to the earth. Tonight, you've arrived at the oldest, heaviest, and most stubborn medium the ancient Indonesians ever wrote on. Stone. You bend down and run your fingers along a series of grooves in the rock's surface. They're weathered and shallow, but still visible. Curling letters, lines like vines, clusters of geometric symbols. Someone knelt here once. Someone held a chisel. And someone, probably sweating through their sarong, decided that this message mattered enough to outlast time itself. Mainstream historical fact. Inscriptions carved into stone stelae. Temple walls, cave faces, and even boulders have been found all over Indonesia, particularly in Java, Sumatra, and South Sulawesi. The earliest datable ones, like the Kedukan Bukit inscription from 683 CE, record royal decrees, religious dedications, or victories in battle. They're often in Old Malay, Sanskrit, or Old Javanese, depending on the kingdom and the period. But you didn't come here just for royal edicts. Let's talk about the other side of stone. The graffiti, the curses, the strange messages etched into sacred caves where no king ever set foot. Because not all stone writing was done for power. Some of it was done for protection, remembrance, or revenge. You pass a low rock outcrop and spot a carving shaped like a fish, surrounded by dots. It's likely a totemic symbol, maybe from the Toraya highlands, where animal carvings were used to represent clan identities. Beneath it, a shallow groove reads like a warning, or maybe a joke. Historians still argue whether the phrase was a boundary marker, a personal name, or something less flattering. This rock belongs to Wayan. Touch it, and your pigs will vanish. Now here's your quirky tidbit. One cave in East Kalimantan holds a series of stone etchings that some locals call the ghost ledger. It features rows of tiny handprints next to carved symbols, each handprint said to represent someone who died far from home. The symbols? Believed to be names, dates, or maybe unfinished wishes. It's as close to an ancient obituary wall as you'll find. And yes, it's haunting in all the right ways. Stone wasn't a casual medium. You didn't write on it unless you really meant to. The tools were crude, the labor intense. A wooden stylus might last you years. But stone? You'd go through chisels like snacks at a night market. And still, people carved. Some carved calendars into boulders, aligning holes and grooves with solar events. Others carved genealogies, mapping family lines down the face of a cliff. And in more than one case, someone carved a lullaby into a stone slab beside a grave. Imagine that, carving comfort into coldness, so the child wouldn't forget the sound of love. One stone tablet from South Sumatra features a mix of Indic script and strange local glyphs no one can quite translate. Scholars can't agree if it's a real language, a cipher, or some elaborate magical formula. What they do know is this. It's surrounded by tiny cup marks filled with rust-colored residue. Beetle juice, maybe blood, maybe something older. It wasn't just read, it was fed. You walk further into the valley and reach a towering rock face covered in carvings, some overlapping, some half erased by time. It's a palimpsest, a layered record of centuries. And as you squint, you spot a recurring motif, a circle with 4 petals. It appears again and again, etched by different hands. A religious symbol, a traveler's signature, or just something that looked cool enough to copy. Historians still argue whether the commoners carved these marks in defiance or devotion. Some say they were prohibited from writing, others that they were simply not trained in script. But the human need to leave a trace doesn't care much for rules. So they scratched what they could. Flowers, hands, spiral paths, animal tracks, until the stone itself remembered them. And then there were the portable stones, smooth river pebbles, each inscribed with a single symbol or word, sometimes stacked or buried beneath house foundations. In North Sulawesi, locals still speak of talking stones, engraved rocks used in healing rituals. You'd place the stone on the chest of a feverish child and whisper the old names until the fever broke. Of course, most writing in stone wasn't magical or royal. It was just stubborn. You can almost hear the stone scoffing, "Paper rots, bark warps." But me, I endure. And it's not wrong. You sit down beside one final slab, a flat stone table with a circle carved into its center. It's not clear what it meant. A gathering spot? A sundial? An altar? Maybe all three. Or maybe none. That's the thing with stone. It remembers everything, but it doesn't explain itself. You reach out, press your palm to the center of the circle and close your eyes. You've walked through forests of bamboo, bark, and soot. You've scratched leaves, oiled planks, and watched firelight dance on coconut shell. And now, at the end, you've found stillness. The breeze is gentle now, barely brushing the grasses. Crickets begin their slow, hypnotic song as the last light fades behind the cliffs. You're still seated by the stone table, but your breathing has softened, your thoughts trailing like mist over the valley floor. The stone beneath your fingers is cool and steady. It doesn't demand attention. It just holds space, like a final punctuation mark at the end of a long sentence. You let the silence fill you, carrying the weight of the words carved through centuries. Some sacred, some silly, some forgotten entirely. They were all written by hands like yours, moved by questions you still carry. What do I need to say? Who will remember? What endures? You don't need to answer. Just let those thoughts float, unhurried and feather light. With every breath, your body grows heavier in the best way. Grounded, wrapped in time, safe. And when you're ready, let your eyes drift closed. The past is still here, written in bark and ash and stone. And now, it's written in you too. Sleep well.